Chapter 3, Day 5 notes, talking about completing the square. So some of you did this in Algebra 2, I think, and maybe some of you didn't. But this is a skill we're going to use for finding parabolas in vertex form, and then also solving equations for quadratics. Okay, so let's just start with an example. First example, it's actually pretty easy. 3x squared plus 24x minus 13. Okay, and what you should know about this right away is this isn't factorable. So we're going to manipulate this a little bit. First thing I want you to do is focus on the x terms. So focus on the x terms only. So that means group with parentheses the things that have x's on them. So 3x squared plus 24x, I want you to group that. So we're going to zoom in and focus on the x terms. Okay, and for this to work, for completing the square to work, we need to have a equal to 1. We can't have anything in front of this x squared. So we need the x squared to be alone. So since we grouped up these x terms, we're just going to factor that 3 out. So factor out the a value. Factor that 3 out front so we can get these x terms in here with that x squared being alone. So we factor 3 out, and that leaves us with x squared plus 8x inside the parentheses. And then I still got this minus 13 hanging out here. Okay, now here's the trick. Here's the whole deal for completing the square. Notice I left some room in here, because I'm going to add something in. So the trick for completing the square is adding b over 2 squared inside there with the x terms. And b would be like this 8 right here. Like, what's the number on this x term? If you think back to standard form, like ax squared plus bx plus c. So b is the number on this x term, so that's 8. So the trick is just add b over 2 squared inside there. So that's 8 over 2 squared. Yeah, that's an easy number, I know. We'll get to that. But here's the thing. We can't just add things in willy-nilly wherever we want and expect it to be equivalent, right? Right now, this line doesn't equal the line before it. So we can't just add in 8 over 2 squared because we feel like it. To be fair, we'd also have to subtract it out here. So we got to subtract that 8 over 2 squared on the outside. Okay, so I'm going to do minus 8 over 2 squared, which is just 4 squared, which is just 16. I know that. So I'm going to subtract it out here. But let's be clear. This isn't really worth 8 over 2 squared, right? This is really worth 3 times 8 over 2 squared. So when we subtract it out here, we got to make sure and address that 3 also. So minus 3 times 8 over 2 squared. Because when we added it in, yeah, it's plus 8 over 2 squared, right? It's plus 4 squared. But it's really worth 3 times that much. So we got to make sure to account for that when we subtract it outside of the parentheses. Okay, now let's just simplify this thing down a little bit. So that's x squared plus 8x plus 4 squared. This is 4 squared as well, right? So that's just 16. Okay. And the whole reason we did this, completing the square bit, is because now this stuff in parentheses here, this trinomial, that should factor very easily. This stuff out here will simplify. We'll get to that in a second. But this stuff in here, x squared plus 8x plus 16, if you'll notice, isn't that just x plus 4, x plus 4? Factors of 16 add up to give you 8. That's really simple. So that's just x plus 4, x plus 4. So our last step here is factor the x terms and then to simplify. So that's x plus 4, x plus 4, better known as x plus 4, that quantity squared. So we're just going to simplify in our last step. So simplify the expression. That's just x plus 4 squared. So we started up here. We did completing the square, which the trick is just add b over 2 squared in here with the x terms. And make sure that x squared term, there's no a value on it, right? Factor that out first thing. And don't forget to subtract that b over 2 squared on the outside. And that's where we're at. So why does that help us? One, that's a little bit easier if we want to talk about vertex form of the parabola. The vertex would right now be at negative 4, negative 61. Also, that would help us, when we get to it, we'll solve equations using this style also. Alright, example 2. Same directions, we're going to complete the square. A little bit different scenario. We're going to start with x squared plus 8x minus 5. So this one actually isn't any more difficult. This one's actually easier. So the first step, again, we're going to focus on those x terms. So I'm going to group them again in parentheses. And then we want that x squared by itself. Well, what do you know? It's already by itself. So that's the point here. We already have a equal to 1. That's a good thing. So there's nothing to factor out to begin with. So that's actually less work for us. So then let's just jump right to the completing the square step. So we add in b over 2 squared to those x terms. So complete the square. The trick is add that b over 2 squared on the inside and then subtract it on the outside. We'll get to that. So x squared plus 8x plus 8 over 2 squared minus 5. And maybe you already are a step ahead and you can simplify that in your head. Right? Parentheses first, that's 4, and then 4 squared, that's 16. Got it. And then don't forget, we added in here, but we can't just add things willy-nilly wherever we want, because then these two lines are not equal to each other. So we have to subtract it on the outside. So subtract it on the outside. So I'll just put minus that same thing on the outside. And let's go ahead and factor and simplify this thing. So I know this is 16. It's going to be minus 21 out here. Again, x plus 4, better known as x plus 4 squared. So our last step, factor and simplify, x plus 4 squared minus 21. That's it. So what's the whole point of this? Well, now we don't really have to do any work to find the vertex. We already know it. The vertex, this would be a shift left 4 and down 21. So it would be at negative 4 comma negative 21 for the vertex. Alright, last example here. This one is a little bit more difficult, but it's the same exact procedure for completing the square. So we're going to start with negative 4x squared plus 12x plus 7. If you'll notice, this is a trinomial. It's also not factorable. Okay, so I'm not going to route the steps or anything. Let's just go through it. We need to focus on those x terms, so let's group those together. And then we need that x squared by itself. Right now there's a negative 4 in front of it. So focusing on these x terms, let's factor out a negative 4. And notice I left some room in my parentheses here. X squared minus 3x, I factored out the negative 4. And we're going to add in b over 2 squared. So negative 3 over 2 squared. And then we can't just add it in here. We also have to subtract it out here. But it's not just, and what this is going to simplify to be square. It's going to be positive 9 over 4. It's not just going to be the 9 over 4 part, right? What is this really worth? Since we added it inside these parentheses, it's got respect to this negative 4 still. So we got to account for that when we subtract it out here. So I'm going to subtract negative 4 times this thing. So when I added it in here, how much was it really worth? Well, with respect to that negative 4, I'm subtracting that product right there. Okay, let's just simplify this a bit. So negative 4, x squared, minus 3x, and then that's going to be, let's see, square the top, square the bottom, that's positive 9 over 4. And then minus a negative, so that's plus 4 times positive 9 over 4. Okay, here's the great thing about completing the square. If you know what b over 2 is, what this thing factors into, you'll see a pattern. Because right now I could ask you this. What are factors of 9 over 4 that would add up to give you negative 3? It turns out it's negative 3 over 2 and negative 3 over 2. So the pattern, what you want to factor this thing into, it'll always be that b over 2 term right there. It'll be like x minus b over 2, and that quantity squared. It could be plus if this is positive. Or if you want to get to this step and think about what it factors into, well, that's great also. Okay, and then what about this stuff I have on the outside? So I got plus 7, and then 4 times 9/4. Those 4s are going to cancel. That's just 9. So really, I'm about done here. Negative 4, x minus 3/2 squared plus 16. So the great part about this is if this is in vertex form, that's a shift to the right 3/2 and then up 16. So the vertex would be at 1.5 comma 16. Okay, so that's it for these examples, but to receive credit for these notes, I want you to do one on your own. So I'm going to give you one here to complete the square. 3x squared plus 15x minus 4. And I want you to do this on your own. I'm going to check tomorrow to make sure you've got it, and that's what I'm going to need to see for you to get credit for the notes. And you know what? I'm such a nice guy, I'm going to go ahead and give you the solution too. So here's the solution. This is completing the square. If all goes well, if I did it correct, this is the solution. So what do I want to see that you can do? Everything from here to here, everything in between. So that's what I'm going to look for tomorrow in these notes. So make sure to have that. Do that right now, and I'll check it first thing tomorrow. All right? I'll see you in class.